The glass doors of the 40th floor swung open, and the air inside the conference room already felt heavy with tension, before anyone had said a single word. Elena Whitfield stepped through them holding a leather folder against her chest, her heels clicking against the polished floor, and she could feel every pair of eyes drifting toward her for a second, then sliding away, as if she were furniture that had wandered in by mistake. She was used to that look. She had seen it in a dozen countries, in a dozen languages, and she had learned long ago that the moment people decided you were unimportant was often the exact moment you had the most power in the room. She took her seat near the end of the long table, close enough to see everything, far enough to be forgotten. Across from her, executives from 3 different countries were already talking over each other, voices clipped and impatient, papers shuffling, coffee cups clinking against saucers. The deal on the table was worth more than most people in that room would earn in a decade, and everyone could feel the weight of it pressing down like a held breath. At the head of the table sat Julien Fontaine, a senior partner from the Paris office, a man whose reputation had arrived in the building long before he had. He had a way of speaking that made every sentence sound like a verdict, and a way of looking at people that made them feel measured and found lacking. He glanced at Elena once, taking in her plain blazer, her modest notebook, the fact that she said nothing and simply sat with her pen ready, and something in his expression settled into quiet dismissal. He turned to the man beside him, a colleague from the Lyon office named Marcel, and murmured something under his breath in French. It was fast, careless, the kind of comment a person makes when they believe no one around them can catch a single word of it. He said that the new girl at the end of the table looked like she had wandered out of the mailroom, that someone should tell her interns were supposed to bring coffee, not sit at the table like she belonged there. Marcel gave a short laugh, the kind people give when they want to seem loyal without fully agreeing, and a couple of nearby colleagues who understood a little French exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure whether to smile or look away. Elena did not flinch. She did not even lift her eyes from the page in front of her. She simply kept writing in small, neat handwriting, letting the comments settle into the room like smoke that no one wanted to acknowledge. Inside, though, something sharpened. She had spent 6 years training herself not to react to insults thrown in a language people assumed protected them, and that discipline held now, steady as a closed door. The meeting began in earnest. The client on the video call was based in Milan, a manufacturing group considering a partnership that would open new markets across Europe, and the stakes were enormous. Numbers were thrown across the table, translators shuffled through headsets, and the mood in the room grew tighter with every passing minute. Julien liked to run these meetings as though he were conducting an orchestra, snapping his fingers at assistants, cutting people off mid-sentence, correcting junior staff in front of clients, as if humiliation were simply part of good business practice. 20 minutes in, a disagreement erupted over a clause in the proposed agreement, something about currency conversion rates and liability windows that even senior staff seemed confused about. Julien tried to explain it to the Milan team in broken, overconfident Italian, mixing up 2 key terms in a way that completely reversed the meaning of what he intended to say. The Italian executives on the screen exchanged confused looks, and one of them, a soft-spoken woman named Bianca, asked for clarification. Her voice edged with concern that the numbers being discussed made no sense. Julien repeated himself, more forcefully this time, as though volume could fix a translation error. The room grew tense. A junior associate reached for her laptop as if she might try to look something up, and someone else shuffled papers nervously, clearly hoping someone smarter than they were would step in before the whole deal collapsed under the weight of one misspoken phrase. That was the moment Elena finally lifted her head. She set her pen down gently, folded her hands on the table, and spoke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that cut through the noise of the room like a single clean note. She spoke in French first, addressing Julien directly, her accent flawless, her grammar precise, in a way that made the room go suddenly, completely silent. She told him, politely but without hesitation, that the clause he had just tried to explain actually meant the opposite of what he believed, and that his comment from earlier about interns and coffee had been heard, understood, and noted. For a moment, nobody in the room breathed. Julien's face went through several colors in quick succession, first pale, then a deep, uncomfortable red that crawled up from his collar to his ears. Marcel beside him stared down at the table, as though the wood grain had suddenly become the most fascinating thing he had ever seen. The junior associates exchanged wide-eyed glances, the kind of look people share when they realize they have just witnessed something they will talk about for years. Elena did not stop there. She turned toward the screen, and without missing a beat, she switched into Italian, her voice warm and steady as she addressed Bianca directly, apologizing for the confusion and offering a precise, correct explanation of the currency clause, walking through the numbers with the practiced calm of someone who had done this 100 times in rooms far more hostile than this one. Bianca's shoulders visibly relaxed. She nodded along, thanked Elena by name, and the tension that had been suffocating the room only moments earlier began, slowly, to lift. Nobody said anything for several seconds after Elena finished speaking. The silence had a texture to it, thick and charged, the kind of silence that follows an earthquake when everyone is still deciding whether it is safe to move. Then, from the far end of the table, the senior partner from the New York office, a composed woman named Grace Ellery, allowed a small, satisfied smile to cross her face, the kind of smile that suggested she had known something the rest of the room had not. Julien opened his mouth, as if to say something, then closed it again. There was nothing he could say that would undo what had just happened. He had insulted someone in a language he assumed gave him cover, in front of a room full of colleagues and clients, and that someone had just corrected his professional error and salvaged his own meeting in 2 languages he had not known she spoke, all within the space of 90 seconds. Elena picked her pen back up, and without any further comment, she returned her attention to her notes, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. But everyone in that room understood that something fundamental had just shifted, that the woman they had dismissed as unimportant only 20 minutes earlier had just proven herself to be the most capable person at the table, and that the man who had mocked her had exposed far more about himself than he had ever intended. The meeting continued, but it moved differently now. Questions that had once been directed automatically toward Julien began drifting toward Elena instead. When a term needed clarifying, when a translation felt uncertain, when the Milan team hesitated over a phrase, eyes turned to the quiet woman at the end of the table, who had said almost nothing for the first half hour, and had just become, without asking for it, the most trusted voice in the room. Grace Ellery leaned toward the colleague beside her and whispered something too quiet for most people to catch, but those close enough heard her say that she had been waiting for exactly this moment since the day Elena had been hired. There was history there, something unspoken, that suggested Elena's presence in that meeting had never been an accident, that someone with real authority had placed her there deliberately, knowing exactly what she was capable of, and knowing, too, that people like Julien would underestimate her until it was far too late to matter. As the meeting wore on, the atmosphere shifted from confrontation into something more productive. Elena continued to step in when needed, smoothing over small misunderstandings, catching errors before they became costly, translating not just words but meaning, the kind of skill that came from years of experience rather than textbooks. She never raised her voice. She never gloated. She never once glanced toward Julien with anything resembling triumph. She simply did her job, and did it better than anyone else in that room could have imagined. By the time the meeting reached its final stretch, the Milan team had grown visibly more comfortable, more willing to negotiate, more trusting of the numbers being presented to them. Bianca specifically requested that future correspondence be routed through Elena, praising her clarity and her patience, unaware, or perhaps entirely aware, of the quiet storm that praise had created among the executives seated around that table in glass and steel. Julien sat through the remainder of the meeting mostly in silence, occasionally offering a comment that no longer carried the same weight it once had. His authority in that room had cracked, not because anyone had shouted at him or reported him, but because everyone present had witnessed, in real time, the gap between the man he presented himself to be and the man his own words had revealed him to be. When the meeting finally ended, chairs scraped back, papers were gathered, and the usual small talk of handshakes and polite farewells filled the room. Elena rose from her seat, gathered her folder, and made her way toward the door with the same quiet composure she had carried in with hours earlier. She did not linger. She did not seek out anyone's reaction. She simply walked out, leaving behind a room full of people who would spend the rest of the day talking about what they had just witnessed. Outside in the hallway, The fluorescent lights hummed softly, and Elena allowed herself a small breath. The first real breath she had taken since Julian's comment had reached her ears nearly 2 hours earlier. She was not angry, not exactly. She had felt that particular sting many times before, in airports, in courtrooms, in negotiation rooms scattered across 3 continents, and she had learned that anger was a poor tool for people who wanted to be taken seriously. What she felt instead was something quieter, steadier, a kind of settled confirmation that the years she had spent building her skills, her languages, her composure, had not been wasted. She walked toward the elevator, her footsteps unhurried, and behind her, through the glass walls of the conference room, she could still see the aftermath of what had happened, the whispered conversations, the stolen glances, the visible discomfort radiating from the man who had assumed, wrongly, that his words were safe, simply because he believed no one else in the room could understand them. What Julian did not yet know, what none of them fully understood in that moment, was that this meeting was only the beginning of a much longer story, one that would unfold over the following days, in ways none of them could predict, and one that would reveal far more about Elena Whitfield than a single afternoon of quiet correction ever could. The elevator doors slid open, and Elena stepped inside alone. As the doors closed, and the numbers above her head began counting downward, she caught her own reflection in the polished steel panel, calm, composed, entirely unremarkable to anyone who did not already know what she carried inside her. She allowed herself a small, private smile, the kind reserved only for moments no one else would ever see, and for the first time that day, she let herself think about everything that had led her to this exact place, this exact room, this exact reckoning that had been years in the making. Because Elena Whitfield had not simply learned 3 languages by accident. She had built her entire life around the ability to hear what others assumed she could not, and she had waited, patiently, for the right moment to prove exactly how far that ability could carry her. That moment, it seemed, had only just begun. News of what had happened in the conference room did not stay contained within those glass walls for long. By the time Elena reached her desk on the 32nd floor, 3 separate colleagues had already stopped by, pretending to need a stapler or a signature, but really just wanting to see her face and confirm that the story spreading through the building was actually true. She answered their questions with the same calm she had shown in the meeting itself, offering only brief, modest replies, careful not to let the moment become bigger than it needed to be. Her manager, a soft-spoken but sharp-minded man named Oliver Bancroft, called her into his office just before lunch. He closed the door behind her, which was unusual, since most of their conversations happened standing at her desk or walking to the elevator. He sat down, folded his hands, and studied her for a long moment before speaking. He told her that word of the meeting had already reached the floor above, and that Grace Ellery herself had mentioned it during a call with the regional director. He asked Elena, carefully, whether she wanted to make a formal complaint about what Julian had said. It was, he reminded her, well within her rights, and the company had clear policies about this kind of behavior, even when it came from someone as senior as Julian Fontaine. Elena considered the question for a moment before answering. She said that she appreciated the offer, but that she did not want the story to become about punishment. She wanted it to be about competence, about the simple fact that she had been underestimated and had proven, calmly and professionally, exactly why that underestimation had been a mistake. She said that people like Julian rarely learned lessons from formal reprimands. They learned lessons from public moments that could not be explained away, moments that lived on in the memory of everyone who witnessed them. Oliver studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, clearly impressed by an answer he had not expected. He told her that regardless of what she decided, her performance in that meeting had not gone unnoticed, and that people far above his own position were already asking questions about who she was, and how she had ended up buried at the end of a conference table instead of leading conversations from the front. That afternoon, Elena returned to her usual work, reviewing contracts, checking translations, quietly doing the kind of detailed, unglamorous work that rarely earned recognition, but formed the backbone of every successful negotiation the firm carried out. She liked the rhythm of it, the precision required, the way a single misplaced word in a legal document could alter the meaning of an entire agreement. It reminded her of piano practice, the discipline of getting small things exactly right so that larger things could function properly. Around 3 in the afternoon, An email arrived in her inbox from an address she did not immediately recognize. It was from Grace Ellery's assistant, requesting that Elena come up to the executive floor for a brief conversation at 4 o'clock. Elena read the message twice, feeling a small flutter of nerves she quickly pushed aside. She had learned long ago that nerves were useful only if they sharpened her focus, and she intended to use them exactly that way. At 4 o'clock, she rode the elevator up to the 52nd floor, a part of the building she had visited only twice before, both times to drop off paperwork, rather than to sit and speak with anyone important. The doors opened onto a hallway lined with dark wood paneling and framed photographs of past deals, past partnerships, past victories the firm liked to remember. Grace's assistant led her into a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river, and Elena took a seat across from a desk that seemed designed to make visitors feel simultaneously welcomed and slightly intimidated. Grace Ellery entered a moment later, closing the door behind her, and settled into her chair with the unhurried confidence of someone who had spent decades earning the right to take her time. She studied Elena for a moment, then smiled, a genuine smile, rather than the polished, professional kind Elena had grown used to seeing around the office. She told Elena that she had heard about the meeting from 3 different people before lunch, and that all 3 versions of the story agreed on every detail, which in her experience almost never happened. She said that she had reviewed Elena's file that morning, her academic background, her years working as an interpreter for international organizations, her fluency in 4 languages, and she admitted, with something close to embarrassment, that she had not fully understood why someone with that background had been placed in a support role so far beneath her capabilities. Elena explained, carefully and without bitterness, that when she had first joined the firm, 8 months earlier, the position offered to her had been the only one available at the time, and that she had accepted it because she needed steady work after leaving her previous position at an international organization where budget cuts had eliminated her entire department. She had assumed, reasonably, that her skills would eventually be noticed, but she had not expected the process to take this long, nor had she expected it to happen through a moment as uncomfortable as the one that had unfolded that morning. Grace listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, her expression thoughtful. When Elena finished, Grace leaned back in her chair and said that she intended to fix that oversight immediately. She explained that the firm was in the process of building a new international negotiations team, one that would work directly with clients across Europe on the firm's most sensitive and highest value deals, and that she wanted Elena to lead the language and communication strategy for that team, a position several levels above the one she currently held. Elena felt something tighten in her chest, not fear exactly, but the particular kind of disbelief that comes when something you have quietly hoped for finally arrives, faster and larger than expected. She thanked Grace, careful to keep her voice steady, and asked what the timeline for the transition might look like. Grace told her that she wanted the change to happen within the week, and that she intended to make the announcement personally, in a way that left no room for anyone in the building to question the decision or attribute it to anything other than merit. She mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Julian would likely have opinions about the change, and that those opinions would not matter in the slightest. As the conversation continued, Grace revealed something Elena had not expected. She explained that Julian's behavior that morning had not been an isolated incident, that there had been quiet complaints from junior staff over the years, comments dismissed as jokes, moments explained away as simply his personality, and that the firm's leadership had been searching for a clear, undeniable example of the pattern before they could act decisively. What had happened in that conference room, Grace said, had provided exactly that. Elena absorbed this information carefully, understanding now that her moment of quiet correction had triggered something larger than she had realized, something that had been building for years before she ever walked through those glass doors. She felt no satisfaction in being part of someone else's downfall, but she understood, with the same clear-headed practicality that guided everything she did, that consequences were simply the natural result of actions, and that Julian's actions had been accumulating consequences long before she had ever entered the picture. Before Elena left the office, Grace asked her one more question, almost casually, though Elena sensed there was nothing casual about it. She asked how many languages Elena actually spoke, since the file only listed 4 with confidence, and rumors around the office that afternoon had already exaggerated the number to something closer to 7 or 8. Elena smiled slightly and admitted that the truth was somewhere in between. that she was fully fluent in 4 languages, comfortable working in 2 more, and had a working knowledge of a 7th that she rarely used professionally, but that had proven useful more than once in unexpected situations. Grace laughed, genuinely delighted, and said that the new negotiations team was going to need exactly that kind of range, especially given the direction the firm's client base had been expanding. Walking back to the elevator afterward, Elena felt the weight of the day settle over her differently than it had that morning. She had walked into the building only hours earlier as someone easily overlooked, and she was leaving it as someone whose quiet competence had just reshaped the trajectory of her entire career. Yet even as satisfaction spread through her, she felt something else too. A small, persistent awareness that Julian had not yet had his final reaction to any of this, and that people who felt humiliated in public rarely simply accepted the consequences without some attempt to push back. She did not yet know how right that instinct would prove to be, nor how quickly the quiet aftermath of that morning would turn into something far more complicated than a simple promotion and a well-earned correction. But for now, riding the elevator down through the heart of the building she had walked into as a stranger, Elena allowed herself to feel, if only for a few minutes, the simple pleasure of being finally, fully seen. The following morning arrived with a strange, electric quality that Elena could feel the moment she stepped out of the elevator on the 32nd floor. Conversations paused as she passed, not out of hostility, but out of a curiosity that people tried and failed to hide. She had expected some reaction, but she had not expected the sheer number of people who suddenly seemed to know her name. Colleagues she had never spoken to before nodding at her in the hallway. An intern from another department offering her a quiet smile of solidarity near the coffee machine. She kept her head down and focused on her work, determined not to let the attention distract her from the responsibilities she still carried. The formal announcement about her new position had not yet been made, and she preferred it that way, wanting to finish her current projects properly before stepping into anything new. She was midway through reviewing a translated contract when her desk phone rang, an internal call from a number she did not recognize. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman named Priya Nandan, someone Elena had met only briefly during her interview process 8 months earlier. Priya explained that she worked directly under Grace Ellery, coordinating logistics for the new international division, and that she wanted to meet with Elena before the end of the day to begin outlining the transition plan. There was warmth in her voice, genuine and unforced, and Elena found herself relaxing slightly as they arranged a time to speak that afternoon. Before that meeting could happen, however, Elena's morning took an unexpected turn. Around 11 o'clock, she received a message asking her to stop by Julian's office, a request delivered not directly from him, but through his assistant, a nervous young man named Felix, who looked as though he would rather have been anywhere else in the building. Elena considered ignoring the request entirely, but she decided instead that facing the conversation directly would be more useful than avoiding it, and that avoidance would only give the moment more power than it deserved. She found Julian standing near the window of his office rather than sitting behind his desk, his posture stiff, his expression carefully arranged into something that resembled composure, but did not quite achieve it. He gestured for her to sit, though he remained standing himself, a small detail that told her more about his state of mind than anything he was about to say. He began by acknowledging, in a tone that suggested the words cost him something, that his comment the previous day had been inappropriate. He said it had been intended as a joke between colleagues, nothing more, and that he had not meant for it to reflect any real judgment about her abilities. Elena listened without interrupting, aware that the explanation was less an apology and more an attempt to reshape the story into something smaller and easier for him to live with. When he finished, she thanked him for the acknowledgement, but she did not soften the moment the way he seemed to expect. She told him, plainly and without anger, that she understood the comment as exactly what it had been, a judgment based entirely on assumptions about her role rather than any actual knowledge of her capabilities, and that the discomfort he felt now was simply the natural consequence of underestimating someone in a room full of witnesses. She said this without raising her voice, without any trace of triumph, delivering the words the same way she might explain a clause in a contract, clearly and without embellishment. Julian's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Elena thought he might respond with the kind of defensive anger she had encountered from other men in similar situations over the years. Instead, he simply nodded, a tight, controlled movement, and said that he understood her position. He mentioned, almost offhandedly, that he had heard about her upcoming transition to the new negotiations team, and something in his tone suggested that this detail bothered him more than the apology itself. Elena rose from her chair, thanked him for his time, and left the office without further comment. She did not feel triumphant walking away, nor did she feel particularly satisfied by the exchange. She felt, instead, a kind of tired clarity, the recognition that some people learned from consequences and others simply endured them, waiting for the discomfort to pass so they could return to old patterns once attention moved elsewhere. She suspected, without knowing for certain, that Julianne belonged to the second category, and she filed that suspicion away carefully, the way she filed away every piece of information that might prove useful later. Her afternoon meeting with Priya proved far more productive and far more energizing. They sat together in a smaller conference room on the 32nd floor, surrounded by laptops and coffee cups, mapping out the structure of the new negotiations team over the course of nearly 2 hours. Priya explained that the team would work across 6 countries initially, coordinating high-value deals that required not just legal expertise, but deep cultural and linguistic fluency, the kind of nuanced understanding that machine translation and junior staff simply could not provide. Elena found herself energized by the scope of the project, sketching ideas on a notepad, suggesting improvements to workflows that Priya had not yet considered, offering insight into cultural nuances that could make or break a negotiation long before anyone reached the actual numbers. Priya listened carefully, occasionally jotting down notes of her own, and by the end of the meeting she admitted, with a laugh, that she was already regretting not having pushed harder to bring Elena onto the team months earlier. As they wrapped up their conversation, Priya mentioned, almost casually, that she had heard whispers about tension building on the executive floor regarding Julian's future with the firm. She said that leadership had scheduled a private meeting for the following week, something unusual and clearly significant, though the exact details remained unclear even to people close to the situation. Elena absorbed this information quietly, unsure how she felt about it. Part of her wanted the matter closed entirely, resolved through her promotion, and nothing more. Another part of her, the part shaped by years of watching powerful people escape consequences again and again, wondered whether this particular story might not end quite so simply. That evening, walking home along streets lined with early autumn light, Elena allowed her mind to wander back over the events of the past 2 days. She thought about her years working as an interpreter for international organizations, the countless rooms she had sat in, where people spoke freely in languages they assumed protected their words, unaware that the quiet woman taking notes understood every syllable. She thought about the sacrifices that had brought her to this point, the years of study, the exhausting travel, the discipline required to master not just vocabulary, but the subtle rhythms and unspoken rules of communication across cultures. She thought, too, about her mother, who had immigrated from Lyon decades earlier and had worked as a hotel housekeeper for most of her life, cleaning rooms for wealthy travelers who rarely looked at her directly, let alone spoke to her as an equal. Her mother had taught her French at home, insisting that Elena learn it properly, formally, not just as a household language, but as a tool that could open doors most people never expected someone like them to walk through. Elena had added Italian during university, drawn to it initially through music, and later through a summer spent working in Florence. And she had picked up German during a 2-year posting with an international agency in Geneva, a posting that had also introduced her to the deeper layers of diplomatic language, the careful phrasing that meant one thing officially and something else entirely between the lines. She had built her career, piece by piece, on the assumption that people would eventually recognize what she had to offer, and though that recognition had arrived slower than she once hoped, it had arrived now, with a force that felt almost overwhelming. She reminded herself, walking those quiet streets, that recognition was not the same as safety, and that the story unfolding around her, however satisfying its early chapters had been, was far from finished. Back at the office the next morning, that suspicion proved correct almost immediately. Elena arrived to find an unusual number of people gathered near the elevators, speaking in low, urgent tones. She caught fragments of conversation as she passed. Mentions of Julian's name, mentions of a formal review, mentions of documents being requested from human resources, dating back several years. Something significant was happening, something larger than a single uncomfortable comment in a conference room. And Elena realized, with a growing sense of unease, that her small act of quiet correction had opened a door that other people had apparently been waiting years to walk through. She reached her desk and found a message waiting from Oliver, asking her to stop by his office as soon as she arrived. She set down her bag, took a steadying breath, and made her way toward his office, uncertain what news awaited her, but increasingly aware that the events set in motion 2 days earlier had grown into something far beyond her original expectations, something that would soon pull her further into the center of a story she had never intended to become the focus of. Oliver's office felt smaller than usual when Elena stepped inside, though nothing about the room had changed, except the mood radiating from the man behind the desk. He gestured for her to sit, and this time he did not waste time with pleasantries. He told her that Human Resources had opened a formal review into Julian's conduct, not just regarding the comment made in the conference room, but covering a pattern of behavior stretching back nearly 5 years, complaints that had been filed quietly over time and never fully investigated, dismissed instead as personality clashes or misunderstandings between colleagues. He explained that Elena's name had come up during preliminary discussions, not because anyone expected her to file a formal complaint, but because her experience represented the clearest, most documented example of the pattern leadership needed in order to move forward decisively. He asked whether she would be willing to provide a written account of what had happened, explaining that her cooperation was entirely voluntary, and that no one would think less of her if she preferred to stay out of the process entirely. Elena sat with the question for a long moment, turning it over carefully in her mind. She thought about the other people who might have filed those earlier, quieter complaints, people who had perhaps lacked the specific set of circumstances that had made her own experience so difficult to dismiss or explain away. She thought about the discomfort of becoming part of a formal investigation, the scrutiny that came with it, the possibility that her promotion might become tangled up with accusations of ambition or opportunism in the eyes of people who did not know her well. But she also thought about the years she had spent being underestimated in rooms across the world, moments smaller than the one in that conference room, but no less demeaning, comments made by people who assumed her silence meant incomprehension rather than restraint. She thought about the interns and junior associates in the building who might one day sit at the end of a table, dismissed and unheard, waiting for someone senior enough to finally take their discomfort seriously. She told Oliver that she would provide the written account, calmly and factually, without exaggeration or emotional appeal, simply describing exactly what had happened and allowing the facts to carry whatever weight they deserved. Oliver nodded, visibly relieved, and thanked her for her willingness to participate in a process that, he admitted honestly, the firm should have handled years earlier. That afternoon, Elena sat at her desk and wrote out a careful, detailed account of the conference room meeting, describing Julian's comment word for word, describing her own response, describing the reaction of the room and the outcome of the negotiation itself. She kept her language measured and precise, resisting the urge to add color or emotion, understanding that the strength of her account lay in its calm, factual clarity, rather than any dramatic flourish. She submitted the document just before the end of the day, feeling a strange mixture of relief and apprehension as she clicked send. She had no way of knowing exactly what would happen next, nor how long the investigation might take, and she forced herself to set the matter aside as best she could, focusing instead on the growing list of responsibilities tied to her upcoming transition or to the new negotiations team. Over the following days, the office settled into an uneasy rhythm. Julian remained visible around the building, though his usual confidence seemed noticeably diminished, his interactions with colleagues shorter and more guarded than before. Elena avoided him where she could, not out of fear, but out of a practical understanding that unnecessary interaction would only complicate an already delicate situation. She threw herself instead into preparing for her new role, spending long hours with Priya, mapping out communication strategies, studying briefing documents on upcoming negotiations, refreshing her knowledge of specific industry terminology in each of her working languages. On Thursday afternoon, nearly a week after the conference room meeting, Grace Ellery called a brief, unscheduled meeting for senior staff across the department. Elena attended, though she had not yet officially transitioned into her new role, standing near the back of the room, alongside colleagues who whispered speculation about what the announcement might contain. Grace entered with her usual composed authority, thanked everyone for gathering on short notice, and delivered the news plainly and without unnecessary drama. She announced that Julien Fontaine would be stepping down from his position at the firm, effective immediately, following the conclusion of an internal review into workplace conduct. She did not elaborate extensively on the details, respecting the confidentiality of the process, but she made clear that the decision reflected a pattern of behavior inconsistent with the firm's values and expectations, and that leadership had determined the situation required decisive action rather than further warnings. A murmur moved through the room, though it was not one of shock, so much as quiet, collective acknowledgement, the sound of people who had long suspected this outcome, finally seeing it confirmed. Elena stood quietly near the back, absorbing the news without visible reaction, aware that eyes occasionally drifted toward her, curious about how she might respond. She kept her expression neutral, neither satisfied nor sorrowful, understanding that this outcome had been building long before she had ever entered the picture, and that her role in it had simply been to provide the clarity that made further avoidance impossible. Grace continued the meeting by announcing the formation of the new international negotiations team, naming Elena as its lead for language and communications strategy, a promotion that drew genuine applause from colleagues who had, in the space of a single week, come to see her as far more than the quiet woman who used to sit at the end of the conference table. Elena accepted the recognition with a brief, gracious nod, thanking Grace and the team for their confidence in her, careful to keep her remarks short and focused rather than drawing the moment out longer than necessary. After the meeting ended, colleagues approached her one after another, offering congratulations, asking questions about the new team, requesting advice about language study or interpretation techniques they hoped might help their own careers. Elena answered each question patiently, grateful for the sudden warmth surrounding her, but also slightly overwhelmed by how quickly her professional life had transformed in the span of a single week. Later that evening, as the office began to empty out, Elena found herself alone in the small conference room she had used with Priya earlier in the week, gathering her notes and preparing to head home. She was startled by a soft knock at the door and looked up to find Bianca, the Italian executive from the video call days earlier, standing in the doorway with a warm smile and a small gift bag in her hand. Bianca explained that she had flown in for meetings with a different department and had asked specifically to stop by and thank Elena in person for her help during the negotiation. She handed over the gift bag, which contained a small box of pastries from a bakery near her office in Milan, and she spoke for several minutes in a mixture of Italian and English, praising Elena's patience and skill, telling her that she had already recommended her by name to 2 other executives within her company who were interested in future partnerships with the firm. Elena thanked her warmly, touched by the gesture, and the 2 women spoke for nearly half an hour about language, about culture, about the strange and specific loneliness of working across borders, where even fluent speakers sometimes felt like outsiders navigating unfamiliar rules. Bianca left eventually, promising to stay in touch, and Elena sat alone in the quiet conference room for a few minutes afterward, turning the small gift bag over in her hands, feeling a warmth that had little to do with professional achievement and everything to do with genuine human connection built across the careful, deliberate work of understanding another person's language and, through it, another person's world. As she finally gathered her things and made her way toward the elevator, Elena allowed herself, for the first time since the entire ordeal had begun, to feel something close to full contentment. The path ahead of her remained uncertain in many ways, filled with new responsibilities and new challenges she had not yet fully prepared for. But she felt, walking out of the building into the cool evening air, that she was finally standing exactly where her years of quiet, patient effort had always been leading her. She did not yet know that this feeling of settled contentment would be tested again soon, in ways that would ask far more of her than a single conference room meeting ever had. Nor did she know that Julien's departure from the firm would not be the end of the story, but simply the closing of its first, most visible chapter. 3 weeks passed, and Elena settled into the rhythm of her new role with a speed that surprised even her own supervisors. She spent her mornings reviewing briefing documents for upcoming negotiations, her afternoons in calls with clients across 4 time zones, and her evenings studying industry terminology that fell outside her usual expertise, determined to master every detail before stepping into rooms where mistakes could cost the firm millions. Priya became not just a colleague, but a genuine friend, the two of them often sharing lunch and comparing notes on the strange, exhausting, exhilarating pace of their new responsibilities. The team grew quickly, adding 2 more specialists within the first month, a sharp-minded German negotiator named Klaus Reiner, and a young Portuguese analyst named Nadia Costa, who had joined the firm straight out of graduate school. Elena found herself, almost without realizing it, settling into a leadership role within the group, not through any formal announcement, but through the natural authority that came from being the person who consistently had the clearest answers and the calmest presence under pressure. It was during this period of steady, satisfying progress that the first sign of trouble appeared, quiet and easy to miss at first, the way most serious problems begin. Elena had been working closely with the Milan team on a second, larger partnership agreement, one that would expand the original deal into new markets across southern Europe. The negotiations were delicate, involving sensitive financial projections and confidential manufacturing details that both companies had agreed to keep strictly contained within a small circle of authorized staff. Elena had personally overseen the translation of every sensitive document, checking and rechecking each version for accuracy and confidentiality. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, she received an unexpected call from Bianca, her voice carrying a tension Elena had not heard before. Bianca explained that a competitor firm in Milan had somehow obtained specific financial projections from the still unfinished agreement, numbers that had only existed within a handful of confidential documents shared exclusively between Elena's team and a small group of executives on the Milan side. The competitor had used this information to undercut a separate deal Bianca's company had been pursuing, causing significant financial damage and raising urgent questions about how such sensitive information could have leaked in the first place. Elena felt a cold, focused alarm settle over her as she listened. She assured Bianca that she would investigate immediately and report back within the day, and she ended the call already running through a mental list of everyone who had access to those specific documents. The list was short, deliberately kept small, precisely because of how sensitive the information was, which made the leak all the more troubling. Something about the timing nagged at her, a suspicion she did not yet want to fully examine. She brought the matter directly to Oliver, who escalated it immediately to the firm's internal security team. Over the following 2 days, a quiet, careful investigation unfolded, reviewing document access logs, email records, and file transfer histories connected to the confidential agreement. Elena worked alongside the security team, providing context about which documents contained which specific figures, helping them narrow down the timeline of when the leaked information could have been accessed. On the 3rd day, the investigation produced a result that sent a ripple of shock through the small group aware of its findings. The access logs showed that someone using an old set of credentials, technically deactivated but not yet fully purged from the system due to an administrative oversight, had accessed the confidential files twice during the 2 weeks following Julien's departure from the firm. The timestamps aligned precisely with a period when Julien, though officially no longer employed, still retained lingering access to certain shared servers due to a transition delay in the firm's technical systems. The revelation landed heavily in the room where Elena, Oliver, and the head of internal security sat reviewing the findings together. It suggested, though did not yet prove conclusively, that Julien had used his lingering access to retrieve confidential information after his departure. Information that had somehow made its way to a competitor in Milan, a competitor that, as it turned out, employed a former colleague of Julien's from earlier in his career, a connection uncovered easily once security began tracing outside communications. Elena felt a complicated mixture of anger and vindication as the details assembled themselves into a coherent picture. She had wanted, weeks earlier, for the matter with Julien to end quietly and completely with his departure from the firm. She had not expected, nor particularly wanted, to find herself once again at the center of a situation involving him, this time with far higher stakes than a single uncomfortable comment in a conference room. The firm's legal team became involved almost immediately, treating the matter with the seriousness it deserved, given the potential for significant financial and reputational damage. Elena was asked to provide detailed documentation of the leaked figures, cross-referencing them against the specific files Julien would have had access to during his brief lingering window into the system. She worked long hours over the following days, meticulous and focused, determined to build a case that left no room for ambiguity or doubt. During this period, She received a call one evening that unsettled her more than anything that had happened since the original conference room incident. The number was unfamiliar, and when she answered, she recognized Julien's voice immediately, tight and controlled, but carrying an undertone of desperation she had never heard from him before. He asked her, without any preamble, to intervene on his behalf, to tell the investigators that the access logs must have been some kind of technical error, that he had done nothing wrong, that his career and reputation were being unfairly destroyed by a situation that had spiraled far beyond what he claimed he ever intended. Elena listened to him for nearly a full minute without responding, weighing her words carefully before she finally spoke. She told him, calmly and without anger, that she had no intention of altering facts to protect him from consequences that were the direct result of his own actions, and that if he was innocent, the proper channel for proving that was through the ongoing investigation, rather than through a personal phone call asking her to intervene informally. She reminded him, gently but firmly, that she had extended him more patience and professionalism in their earlier conversation than his original comment had ever warranted, and that she did not intend to extend any further consideration now that the situation involved potential criminal activity rather than simple workplace rudeness. Julien's tone shifted after that, the desperation curdling into something colder, and he said several things Elena chose not to dwell on afterward. Comments about her ambition, about how she had orchestrated his downfall from the very beginning, about how none of this would have happened if she had simply stayed quiet in that conference room weeks earlier. Elena let him finish, then told him, in a voice that remained steady despite the ugliness of his words, that she had said nothing untrue in that conference room, and that everything that had happened since then had been the result of his own choices rather than hers. She ended the call without further comment, setting her phone down on the table, with hands that trembled slightly despite her outward composure. She reported the call immediately to the firm's legal team, understanding that it represented an important piece of the broader picture, forming around Julien's conduct both before and after his departure. The legal team thanked her for the information, noting that it would be factored carefully into the ongoing proceedings, and assured her that appropriate measures were already being taken to protect both the firm's interests and her own safety, given the increasingly personal tone Julien's communications had begun to take. That night, Elena sat alone in her apartment, staring out at the city lights scattered across the darkened skyline, feeling for the first time since this entire situation began, a genuine, unsettling uncertainty about where it might ultimately lead. She had wanted only to do her job well, to be recognized for skills she had spent years developing, and instead, she had found herself pulled into something far larger and more dangerous than she had ever anticipated, a situation involving corporate espionage, legal proceedings, and a man whose resentment toward her seemed to be growing, rather than fading, with each passing week. She thought about calling a friend, about seeking comfort from someone outside the tangled web of her professional life, but instead she simply sat with her thoughts for a long while, reminding herself of the discipline that had carried her through every difficult room she had ever walked into. She had built her career on remaining calm under pressure, on trusting facts over fear, and she intended to carry that same discipline forward now, regardless of how uncomfortable or uncertain the coming weeks might become. The investigation, she knew, was far from finished, and Julien's reaction to being confronted suggested that he had no intention of accepting the consequences of his actions quietly. Whatever came next, Elena understood that she would need to remain more careful, more vigilant, and more prepared than she had ever been before, because the man she had once dismissed as simply arrogant and unpleasant had revealed himself, in the span of a single phone call, to be someone capable of far more troubling behavior than she had originally believed. The days following the phone call moved with a strange, careful tension that settled over Elena's life like a low, persistent hum she could not quite silence. She continued her work with the same discipline she always brought to every task, but she found herself glancing more often toward the entrance of the office in the mornings, checking her phone more frequently for messages from unfamiliar numbers, and staying slightly later at her desk than usual, simply because the walk home in daylight felt more comfortable than the walk home in darkness. The firm's security team, working alongside outside legal counsel, moved quickly once the pattern of Julien's unauthorized access became clear. Within a week, they had assembled a detailed timeline, showing exactly when he had logged into the system, which files he had accessed, and how those files corresponded precisely to the information that had surfaced with the competitor firm in Milan. The evidence was thorough enough that the firm's legal department decided to pursue formal action, both to recover damages related to the leaked information and to ensure that Julian faced consequences serious enough to prevent any further attempts at retaliation. Elena was asked to provide a formal statement as part of the legal proceedings, detailing not only the original conference room incident, but also the phone call Julian had made to her afterward, including his comments suggesting that she bore responsibility for his downfall. She sat with a lawyer from the firm's outside counsel, a careful, precise woman named Grace Delacroix, who walked her through the process of giving a formal deposition, explaining exactly what to expect, and reassuring her that the firm intended to provide whatever support she needed throughout the process. Grace Delacroix explained, during one of their sessions, that cases involving unauthorized data access, combined with any element of personal threat or intimidation, were taken extremely seriously by both the firm and, if necessary, by outside authorities. She asked Elena directly whether she had felt physically threatened during the phone call, and Elena considered the question carefully before answering that she had not felt an immediate physical threat, but that something in Julian's tone had left her deeply unsettled, a coldness beneath his anger that suggested he was not simply venting frustration, but genuinely searching for someone to blame for consequences he refused to accept as his own. This assessment proved prescient sooner than Elena would have liked. Nearly 2 weeks after the initial phone call, as the legal proceedings against Julian began moving through their early formal stages, Elena received a message through a professional networking platform from an account that did not immediately reveal itself as belonging to him. The message was brief but unmistakable in its intent, referencing details about her daily schedule that no stranger should have known, mentioning the specific coffee shop near her apartment where she often stopped before work, and ending with a line suggesting that she should reconsider her cooperation with the ongoing investigation before matters became, as the message phrased it, unnecessarily complicated for everyone involved. Elena's hands went cold reading the message, and for a long moment she simply sat frozen at her desk, the office around her continuing its ordinary rhythm of ringing phones and quiet conversation, entirely unaware that something had just shifted dangerously beneath the surface of her carefully constructed professional life. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to resist the urge to react impulsively, and instead took a screenshot of the message, before reporting it immediately to Oliver, who escalated the matter within minutes to both the legal team and building security. The response from the firm was swift and serious. Security reviewed the message and, working with the platform's own investigators, traced it back to an account created only days earlier, using information that closely matched patterns associated with Julian's known online activity. While the connection was not immediately conclusive enough for criminal charges related to the message itself, it was more than sufficient to prompt the firm's legal team to seek an emergency protective order on Elena's behalf, a formal legal measure designed to prevent Julian from making any further contact with her, directly or indirectly, while the broader investigation continued. Grace Delacroix met with Elena personally that afternoon, her expression serious but reassuring, explaining the protective order process in careful detail, and emphasizing that the firm would provide additional security measures during this period, including a temporary security escort for Elena during her commute, and enhanced monitoring around the building's entrances. Elena listened to the explanation with a strange, detached calm, the kind of calm that often settles over people when the reality of a threatening situation finally becomes too large to fully absorb all at once. That evening, walking out of the building flanked discreetly by a member of the firm's security team, a quiet, watchful man named Daniel Pierce, Elena found herself thinking back to the conference room weeks earlier, to the small, contained moment of correction that had felt, at the time, like nothing more than a simple assertion of her own competence. She had not imagined, in her wildest projections of how that day might unfold, that it would eventually lead to legal proceedings, corporate espionage, and now the unsettling reality of needing protection from a man who had once simply mocked her clothing in a language he assumed she could not understand. Daniel walked beside her in comfortable silence for most of the journey, occasionally scanning the street around them with the practiced awareness of someone trained to notice details most people overlooked. As they approached her apartment building, he paused and told her, in a tone that carried genuine reassurance rather than empty professional courtesy, that people who resorted to intimidation after being caught in serious wrongdoing were, in his considerable experience, almost always driven by panic rather than genuine capability for harm. He explained that Julian's message, threatening as it felt, actually suggested a man cornered and desperate, rather than someone operating from a position of real power or control, and that desperation, while unsettling, was usually far less dangerous in practice than calculated confidence. Elena found some comfort in his words, though she remained careful and alert over the following days, adjusting small habits in her routine, varying her walking routes, keeping her phone charged and close at all times. The investigation into Julian continued to progress, gathering additional evidence, not only about the data leak, but now also about the threatening message, building toward a case that seemed increasingly likely to end, not just in his permanent removal from the professional world he had once dominated, but potentially in serious legal consequences that extended far beyond the loss of his position at the firm. Nearly a week after the threatening message, Elena received word through Grace Delacroix that authorities had located Julien in a small town outside Lyon, where he had traveled shortly after the message was sent, apparently attempting to distance himself from the growing legal pressure building against him in the city. He was taken in for formal questioning regarding both the unauthorized data access and the threatening communication, and though the full legal process would take considerable time to resolve completely, the immediate danger to Elena's safety diminished significantly once his whereabouts and activities came under close official scrutiny. The protective order remained in place, and the security escorts continued for several more weeks as a precaution, but Elena felt, gradually, the tight knot of anxiety in her chest begin to loosen. She returned to her work with renewed focus, determined not to let fear define the shape of her days, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that the experience had not diminished her confidence, but had instead sharpened it into something even more resilient than before. She thought often, during this period, about the strange, unpredictable path that had led her from a quiet seat at the end of a conference table to the center of a legal case involving corporate espionage and personal intimidation, and she understood, with a clarity that felt almost philosophical, that the moment she had chosen to speak up in that meeting had set into motion consequences far beyond anything she could have originally imagined. She did not regret that moment, not even now, understanding that silence in the face of that original insult would have changed nothing about who Julien truly was, only delayed the eventual reckoning that his own choices had made inevitable. What remained uncertain, as the weeks continued to pass, was exactly how this complicated, difficult chapter of her life would finally come to a close, and whether the resolution, whenever it arrived, would bring her the sense of complete safety and closure she found herself quietly, desperately hoping for. Winter arrived early that year, settling over the city with a crisp, biting wind that rattled the windows of Elena's apartment each evening as she reviewed documents late into the night. The legal proceedings against Julien had entered a slower, more procedural phase, the kind of extended waiting period that lawyers described as normal, but that left Elena feeling perpetually suspended between chapters of a story she desperately wanted to see finished. Grace Delacroix continued to update her periodically, explaining that formal charges related to the unauthorized data access had been filed, and that a separate investigation into the threatening message remained ongoing, moving through the careful, methodical channels required by law. Despite the uncertainty hanging over the legal case, Elena's professional life continued to flourish in ways that offered a welcome counterbalance to the tension of the ongoing investigation. The international negotiations team she led had successfully closed 3 additional partnerships since the original Milan deal, each negotiation requiring the kind of careful, culturally attuned communication that had become her specialty within the firm. Klaus and Nadia had grown into confident, capable members of the team, and Priya had been promoted to oversee an even larger portfolio of international clients, a change that brought the 2 women even closer as colleagues and friends. One afternoon in early December, Elena received an unexpected invitation to speak at an industry conference focused on cross-cultural business communication, an event that would bring together professionals from across Europe to discuss best practices in international negotiation. She accepted the invitation with a mixture of excitement and nervousness, recognizing the opportunity as a significant step forward in establishing herself as a genuine expert in her field, rather than simply a skilled employee within a single firm. Preparing for the conference gave her something productive to focus her energy on during the tense weeks of waiting for updates on Julian's case, and she poured herself into crafting a presentation that drew on her years of experience navigating the subtle, often invisible barriers that language and culture created in professional settings. She used, though carefully anonymized, elements of her own experience as a case study, discussing how assumptions about competence based on appearance or perceived role could lead to serious professional and even legal consequences when left unchecked. The conference took place in early January, held in a large convention center on the outskirts of the city, gathering hundreds of professionals from across the continent. Elena's presentation, scheduled for the second day, drew a larger audience than she had expected, filling most of the seats in a mid-sized conference hall and even attracting a few people standing quietly near the back when the room reached capacity. She spoke clearly and confidently, weaving together practical advice with broader observations about how easily talented people could be overlooked simply because they did not fit expected molds of authority or expertise. The presentation received a warm, engaged reception, and during the question and answer session afterward, several attendees asked pointed, thoughtful questions about strategies for addressing bias in high-stakes negotiation settings. Elena answered each question with the same measured clarity she brought to every professional interaction, drawing occasional laughter with a few carefully chosen examples, and leaving the room, by the end of the session, with a palpable sense of having genuinely connected with her audience. After the session ended, a steady stream of attendees approached her, exchanging business cards, asking follow-up questions, expressing interest in future collaboration. Among them was a composed, thoughtful woman named Claire Devereaux, who introduced herself as a director at a large international consulting firm specializing in cross-border business strategy. Claire explained that she had been deeply impressed by Elena's presentation and wanted to discuss a potential opportunity, mentioning that her firm was in the process of building a specialized advisory practice focused on exactly the kind of cultural and linguistic expertise Elena had just spent the last hour discussing. They exchanged contact information, and over the following weeks, Elena found herself engaged in a series of increasingly serious conversations with Claire's firm, exploring the possibility of a new role that would allow her to work across an even broader range of industries and countries, advising companies directly on how to navigate exactly the kind of costly, embarrassing missteps that Julian's original comment had represented in miniature. The opportunity was exciting, though it also raised complicated questions about loyalty to the firm that had, despite everything, ultimately recognized her talent and given her the platform from which this new opportunity had emerged in the first place. She discussed the situation openly with Grace Ellery, who listened with the same thoughtful attention she had shown from their very first conversation months earlier. Grace acknowledged, without any trace of resentment, that opportunities like the one Claire's firm was offering came rarely, and that she would never want to stand in the way of Elena's growth simply to serve the firm's own interests. She suggested, instead, a middle path, proposing that Elena might take on a hybrid role, continuing to lead select negotiations for the firm, while also beginning to build the kind of advisory practice Claire had described, essentially allowing her to explore this new direction without fully severing the relationship that had given her this platform in the first place. Elena found the proposal thoughtful and generous, and after careful consideration, she agreed to the arrangement, feeling a genuine sense of gratitude toward Grace for handling the situation with such grace and flexibility. The transition took shape gradually over the following months, and Elena found herself increasingly recognized within her professional field, invited to speak at additional conferences, quoted in a handful of industry publications discussing the intersection of language, culture, and business strategy. Throughout this period of professional growth, the legal case against Julian continued its slow progression through the courts. In late February, Grace Delacroix called Elena with significant news. Julian had agreed to a plea arrangement regarding the unauthorized data access charges, accepting responsibility in exchange for a reduced sentence that nonetheless included a substantial fine, a permanent ban from working within the financial and legal services industry, and a formal restraining order extending well beyond the original protective measures already in place. The separate investigation into the threatening message had concluded as well, resulting in additional charges that added further weight to the consequences he now faced. Elena listened to the news with a complicated mixture of relief and something quieter, something closer to simple, exhausted closure. She had not sought this outcome from the very beginning, had never wanted to become the center of a story involving legal proceedings and personal danger, and yet she recognized, hearing the final resolution of the case, that justice had ultimately been served in a manner that felt proportionate and fair, given everything that had unfolded since that first uncomfortable comment in the conference room nearly a year earlier. She thanked Grace Delacroix sincerely for her tireless work throughout the case, and after ending the call, she sat quietly at her desk for a long while, allowing herself to fully absorb the weight of everything that had happened. The long, complicated journey, from that quiet Tuesday morning meeting to this final moment of legal resolution. She thought about how much her life had changed in the span of a single year, how a single moment of quiet, calm correction had unraveled a career built on assumptions and arrogance, had exposed patterns of behavior that had gone unchecked for years, and had ultimately opened a path toward opportunities she had never imagined possible when she first walked through those glass doors as an overlooked, underestimated new employee. The story, she understood now, was finally beginning to reach its true conclusion, though the lessons embedded within it, about competence, about assumption, about the quiet power of simply being underestimated and proving otherwise, would stay with her for the rest of her career, shaping the way she approached every room she walked into from that point forward. Spring arrived with a gentleness that felt almost symbolic after the long, tense months that had preceded it, and Elena noticed, walking to work along streets lined with newly blooming trees, a lightness in her step that had been absent for the better part of a year. The legal case had reached its formal conclusion. The protective order remained active as a permanent safeguard, and Julien Fontaine, once a man whose name commanded quiet fear across an entire floor of executives, had faded almost entirely from the daily rhythm of her life, a distant chapter closed, rather than an ongoing presence she needed to guard against. Her hybrid role, balancing leadership of the firm's negotiations team with the growing advisory practice she had begun building alongside Claire Devereaux's firm, had settled into a demanding but deeply satisfying rhythm. She traveled more frequently now, spending long weekends in Milan, Berlin, and occasionally Lisbon, working directly with companies, eager to avoid exactly the kind of costly cultural missteps that had once defined the early chapter of her own career at the firm. She found genuine fulfillment in this work, not simply because of the professional recognition it brought her, but because of the quieter, more personal satisfaction of helping other talented, overlooked people find their own moments of recognition before those moments required the kind of painful, drawn-out process her own journey had involved. One afternoon in April, while reviewing materials for an upcoming presentation, Elena received a message from Nadia, the young analyst who had joined her team the previous year, asking if she had a few minutes to talk privately. Elena agreed immediately, sensing something serious in the careful, hesitant phrasing of the message, and the two women found a quiet corner of the office to speak away from the usual bustle of the floor. Nadia explained, her voice tight with the particular nervousness of someone unsure whether raising a concern would be taken seriously, that a senior executive visiting from another department had made several comments during a recent meeting that echoed, in smaller but unmistakable ways, the same dismissive assumptions Elena had once faced from Julien. The executive had spoken over her repeatedly during a presentation, had directed technical questions to a male colleague standing beside her, despite the fact that Nadia had prepared the entire analysis herself, and had, at one point, referred to her within earshot as simply the assistant handling the numbers. Elena listened carefully, feeling a familiar, protective anger rise within her, tempered by the calm, practical instincts that had carried her through so many difficult situations over the past year. She thanked Nadia for trusting her with this information, and she assured her that the firm's culture around these issues had changed significantly since the events of the previous year, that leadership now took such patterns seriously rather than dismissing them as simple personality clashes. Together, they discussed the best way to address the situation, and Elena offered to accompany Nadia to a conversation with Oliver, providing support without taking over the process entirely, understanding intuitively that Nadia needed to find her own voice within this situation, rather than having someone else speak entirely on her behalf. She shared with Nadia, briefly and without excessive detail, some of the lessons she had learned from her own experience, emphasizing the importance of documenting incidents clearly and calmly, and reminding her that competence, demonstrated consistently and confidently, remained the most powerful tool available in moments when others attempted to diminish her presence in a room. Over the following weeks, Elena watched with quiet pride as Nadia handled the situation with a composure and clarity that reminded her strongly of her own journey the previous year. Nadia raised her concerns formally, backed by clear documentation, and the firm responded swiftly, addressing the visiting executive's behavior through a formal conversation with his own leadership team, a conversation that resulted in a genuine, if somewhat awkward, apology, and a noticeable shift in how he interacted with junior staff during subsequent visits. This small, contained resolution offered Elena a satisfying sense of continuity, a reminder that the changes she had helped set into motion within the firm extended beyond her own individual story, creating space for others to be heard and respected in ways that had once felt impossibly out of reach. She began, gradually, to take on a more formal mentorship role within the firm, meeting regularly with junior staff, particularly women and employees from immigrant backgrounds, who often described feeling exactly the kind of quiet, persistent underestimation she herself had experienced for years before that pivotal conference room meeting. In May, Grace Ellery invited Elena to a private lunch, a rare informal gathering away from the usual pace of office life. Over a quiet meal at a small restaurant near the river, Grace reflected openly on the changes the firm had undergone over the past year, acknowledging candidly that Julian's behavior had been allowed to continue for far too long before decisive action was finally taken. She thanked Elena not just for her professional contributions, but for the courage and composure she had shown throughout an experience that had asked far more of her than any reasonable employee should ever have to endure. Elena accepted the gratitude graciously, though she gently reminded Grace that the true measure of the firm's growth would not be found in this single resolved case, but in the ongoing, consistent culture that continued to develop in its aftermath. The culture that had allowed Nadia to speak up recently, with far more confidence and far less fear than Elena herself had once felt. Grace nodded thoughtfully, clearly moved by the observation, and the two women spent the remainder of their lunch discussing plans for expanding the firm's commitment to training and awareness around exactly these kinds of cultural and interpersonal dynamics. As summer approached, Elena found herself reflecting more often on the strange, winding path that had brought her to this point in her career. A path that had begun with a single dismissive comment, whispered in a language someone assumed she could not understand. She thought about her mother, who had spent decades cleaning hotel rooms for people who rarely looked at her directly, and she thought about how proud her mother would be, watching her daughter now stand at the front of conference rooms and lecture halls, speaking with authority in 4 languages, guiding conversations that shaped the direction of entire companies. She had grown, over the course of that difficult, transformative year, into someone far more confident than the quiet woman who had once sat silently at the end of a long table, absorbing insults without visible reaction. Yet she remained, at her core, the same patient, disciplined person she had always been. Someone who understood that true strength rarely announced itself loudly, and that the most powerful responses to cruelty and dismissal often came not through anger, but through calm, undeniable competence, delivered at exactly the right moment. The story that had begun with mockery, in a language assumed to be private, had ended, nearly a year later, with justice served through proper legal channels, with a career transformed beyond anything she could have imagined, and with a quieter, more personal legacy taking root within the walls of the firm that had once nearly overlooked her entirely. Elena understood, walking home that evening through streets warmed by the early promise of summer, that this particular chapter of her life had finally, fully closed, even as countless new chapters waited patiently ahead, chapters she intended to meet with the same calm, unwavering confidence that had carried her through everything that came before. By autumn, nearly 18 months after the morning that had changed the course of her career, Elena stood backstage at a large international conference hall in Brussels, waiting to deliver the opening keynote address for a gathering of business leaders from across the continent. The event, one of the largest of its kind in Europe, had invited her specifically to speak about the hidden costs of underestimating talent within global organizations, a topic she now understood with a depth of experience few speakers in her field could genuinely claim. She adjusted the small microphone clipped to her jacket, taking a slow breath as she listened to the host introduce her to the waiting audience, describing her impressive list of credentials, her leadership of a groundbreaking advisory practice, her fluency across 5 languages, and her reputation as one of the most sought-after voices in cross-cultural business strategy. Elena felt none of the nervous uncertainty that had once gripped her in unfamiliar rooms, understanding now, with quiet confidence, that she belonged exactly where she stood. As she walked onto the stage to warm applause, she scanned the audience briefly, taking in the sea of attentive faces representing dozens of countries and industries, and she found herself thinking, just for a moment, about the version of herself who had once sat silently at the end of a conference table, absorbing insults without visible reaction. That version of herself had never imagined standing here, commanding a room of this size with nothing but her own expertise and composure. Her presentation unfolded smoothly, weaving together practical strategy with deeper reflections on the costs, both financial and human, of allowing bias and assumption to shape professional environments unchecked. She spoke about the importance of listening carefully, of never assuming silence meant incomprehension, of understanding that genuine competence rarely announced itself loudly, but instead revealed itself patiently, precisely, at exactly the moment it mattered most. The audience listened with rapt attention, and by the time she reached her closing remarks, she could sense the particular quality of silence that meant a room had been genuinely moved, rather than simply entertained. After the keynote concluded, during a networking reception held in the grand hall adjoining the main stage, Elena found herself approached by countless attendees eager to discuss her ideas further, exchange contact information, or simply express gratitude for a perspective they had not encountered quite so clearly articulated before. Among the crowd, she noticed a familiar face making its way toward her, and she felt a small, warm smile spread across her features as Bianca approached, looking as elegant and composed as ever, having traveled specifically to attend the conference and support Elena's keynote in person. The two women embraced warmly, and Bianca explained, with evident pride, that the partnership originally negotiated during that pivotal meeting years earlier had grown into one of the most successful cross-border collaborations either of their companies had ever pursued, generating opportunities and revenue far beyond initial projections. She credited much of that success directly to the careful, patient communication work Elena had provided throughout the process, work that had prevented countless small misunderstandings from ever growing into larger, costlier problems. As the reception continued, Priya arrived as well, having traveled from the firm's headquarters specifically to support Elena during this significant professional milestone. The three women spent the remainder of the evening together, sharing stories, laughing over shared memories from the earlier, more turbulent chapters of their professional journeys, and reflecting on how much had changed since those uncertain early days when Elena had first stepped into her expanded role. Later that night, back in her hotel room overlooking the quiet, lamplit streets of Brussels, Elena sat by the window with a cup of tea, reviewing messages that had accumulated throughout the day. Congratulations from colleagues, requests for future speaking engagements, a warm note from Nadia, describing her own recent success, leading an entire negotiation independently for the first time. Elena read each message slowly, allowing herself to fully absorb the quiet satisfaction of a life built carefully, deliberately, through years of patient effort, finally reaching a place of genuine, well-earned recognition. She thought, as she often did during quiet moments like this one, about the strange, unpredictable nature of the path that had brought her here. A single careless comment, spoken in a language assumed to offer protection, had set into motion a chain of events that reshaped not only her own career, but the culture of an entire firm, creating space for people like Nadia to find their voices with far more confidence than Elena herself had once possessed. She understood now, with the clarity that only distance and reflection could provide, that her response in that original conference room had never truly been about defeating one arrogant man, but about refusing to let his assumptions define the boundaries of what she was capable of achieving. Before turning in for the night, Elena opened her laptop and began drafting notes for an article she had been asked to contribute to an international business publication, reflecting on the lessons she had learned throughout her unexpected journey from overlooked employee to recognized industry expert. She wrote carefully, thoughtfully, choosing each word with the same precision she brought to every negotiation, understanding that her story, however personal, carried lessons that extended far beyond her own individual experience. Lessons about patience, about competence, about the quiet, transformative power of simply refusing to be underestimated. As she finally closed her laptop and settled into bed, the city lights of Brussels glowing softly beyond her window, Elena allowed herself a final moment of quiet gratitude for everything that had led her to this point, understanding that the most difficult chapters of her journey had ultimately produced the strongest, most meaningful chapters still unfolding ahead of her. 2 years after that first uncomfortable morning in the conference room, Elena returned to the same building where her entire journey had begun, though almost everything about the experience felt different now. She no longer entered through the lobby as an overlooked employee hoping simply to be noticed. She arrived now as a respected consultant, invited back specifically to lead a training session for new hires, part of an expanded onboarding program the firm had developed in the aftermath of everything that had happened. A program designed specifically to help new employees recognize and address exactly the kind of dismissive, biased behavior that had once nearly derailed her own career before it truly began. Standing at the front of a familiar conference room, though a different one this time, larger, and filled with eager new faces representing a dozen different countries and backgrounds, Elena looked out at the group and felt a deep, settled satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal triumph and everything to do with genuine purpose. She spoke to them plainly, honestly, sharing carefully selected pieces of her own story, not as a tale of revenge or victory, but as a practical lesson about the importance of competence, patience, and quiet confidence in the face of assumption and dismissal. She told them about walking into that first meeting years earlier, about the discomfort of being overlooked, about the discipline required to remain calm, even when every instinct urged an immediate reaction. She explained that the most powerful moment of her career had not come from anger or confrontation, but from simply allowing her own preparation and skill to speak clearly when the right moment finally arrived. She emphasized, repeatedly, that this patience was not passivity, but a deliberate, strategic choice, one that had ultimately proven far more effective than any immediate emotional response could have been. The new employees listened intently, several taking careful notes, a few asking thoughtful questions about how to handle similar situations in their own early careers. Elena answered each question honestly, acknowledging that there was no single formula for navigating these moments perfectly, but offering practical guidance rooted firmly in her own hard-won experience, encouraging them to document concerning behavior clearly, to seek support from trusted colleagues and mentors, and above all, to trust in the value of their own preparation and expertise, even when others around them seemed determined to overlook it. After the training session concluded, Oliver approached her in the hallway, looking older now, grayer at the temples, but carrying the same warm, steady demeanor she remembered from their very first difficult conversation years earlier. He thanked her for returning, noting how much the firm's culture had genuinely shifted since those turbulent early days, crediting much of that change directly to the precedent her own experience had established. He mentioned, with a small, proud smile, that the firm had recently celebrated its most diverse and successful year yet, in terms of promoting talent from within its ranks, a statistic he attributed largely to the cultural shift that had begun with a single quiet correction, spoken calmly in a language someone had wrongly assumed offered them protection. Walking out of the building that afternoon, Elena paused for a moment on the sidewalk, looking up at the tall glass structure that had once represented, in her memory, a place of quiet humiliation and uncertain belonging. Now it represented something else entirely, a place where her own resilience had ultimately reshaped not just her personal career trajectory, but the broader environment for countless employees who would walk through those same doors long after she had moved on to other opportunities. She thought, standing there in the late afternoon sunlight, about Julien, about where his own choices had ultimately led him, a permanent exile from the industry he had once dominated so confidently, a stark and undeniable reminder that arrogance and cruelty carried consequences that eventually, inevitably, caught up with those who wielded them carelessly. She felt no lingering anger toward him now, only a quiet, settled understanding that his downfall had never truly been about her at all, but about the simple, unavoidable truth that his own behavior had been unsustainable long before she ever entered his path. Her phone buzzed gently in her pocket, and she glanced down to find a message from Nadia, now leading her own team of junior analysts, sharing news of a successful negotiation she had just completed independently, thanking Elena once again for the guidance and mentorship that had helped shape her own growing confidence. Elena smiled, typing back a warm, encouraging reply, feeling the particular satisfaction of watching someone she had mentored step fully into their own capability and strength. As she made her way toward the train station, weaving through the familiar streets of a city that had witnessed so much of her personal and professional transformation, Elena allowed her thoughts to drift forward rather than backward, toward the expanding advisory practice she now led, toward the growing list of speaking engagements filling her calendar for the coming year, toward the quiet, ongoing work of mentoring the next generation of talented, often overlooked professionals, who reminded her, in small ways, of the woman she herself had once been. She understood, with the clear, settled wisdom that only time and reflection could provide, that her story had never truly been about proving a single arrogant man wrong, though that moment had certainly mattered deeply in its own right. Her story had always been about something larger, about the quiet, persistent power of competence, patiently developed over years, about the importance of never allowing someone else's assumptions to define the limits of what she was capable of achieving, and about the ripple effects that a single moment of calm, well-earned confidence could create, extending far beyond the walls of any single conference room, reshaping careers, cultures, and lives in ways she could never have fully predicted on that ordinary Tuesday morning when everything had first begun. As the train pulled away from the station, carrying her toward her next engagement, her next opportunity, her next chapter in a career built on patience and quiet, undeniable skill, Elena looked out the window at the city passing by and felt, more strongly than ever before, a deep and lasting sense of peace with exactly who she had become, and genuine excitement for everything still waiting ahead.